Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining us. In the internet age, we got to be on time for our friends on the internet who are viewing us, so welcome those of you joining us online. The title of this panel today at Judicial Watch is The Oversight Gap, Watchdogging the Obama Administration. I'm Tom Fitton, President of Judicial Watch. Judicial Watch is a conservative, nonpartisan educational foundation dedicated to transparency, integrity, and accountability in government politics and the law. Through our educational activities, we advocate high standards of ethics and morality in our nation's public life and seek to ensure that the political class and the American people are in sync in terms of the expectations of ethics. Judicial Watch does not endorse or oppose candidates for public office. And we are pleased to present this panel today on the continuing failure of key D.C. institutions to conduct meaningful oversight of the operations of the federal government, especially the Obama administration. Despite an increase in controversial government actions under the Obama administration, there has been a marked decline in related independent investigative journalism and congressional oversight. Independent watchdog groups and the new media have risen to fill this oversight gap. And to get more specific, the federal government, and you can be pleased or unhappy about this, but it's increased its activities by about $1 trillion a year. It's increased by about a third in terms of the activity it's doing. But congressional oversight has decreased by even a greater amount. There used to be, as best I could tell, about 5,000 congressional oversight hearings a year. Now it's about 3,000. So the government's increased by a third, but the congressional oversight over that activity has decreased by an even greater amount. And of course, major media institutions have not, the so-called legacy media, have not risen to meet the challenge of that increased need for oversight. And we can spend a lot of time critiquing the mainstream media bias, but the liberal bias that buys into a lot of government thinking without question, and the instincts of a lot of the media class to serve as commentators rather than hardcore investigators into government activity. In many ways, the critique of the media as being more government media than ever before, I think, is very credible. And of course, Congress has its myriad of problems in conducting congressional oversight. Of course, those that want to do the work are hamstrung by ineffective laws and oversight mechanisms to get at government activity. Darrell Issa can only do so many things. You need 1,000 Darrell Issas to run to all the fires on the horizon that Barack Obama has set in terms of government controversial actions. And not only, of course, the ineffective institution and mediating institutions of Congress, but that the Congress has in terms of tools, but you have the congressional politicization, the fights in Congress over politics, the idea that when Republicans go after Democrats and Democrats go after Republicans, you can't believe whatever any side says because it is politics or it's just politics. In some cases that's right. In many cases that's right. In some cases it's wrong, but in many cases that's right. And of course Congress is conflicted. And that goes to the politicization. You have to wonder when Congress is going after the president, is it because they're seriously concerned about oversight or they just want to score a political point? And the same goes when Congress doesn't go after the president. Does it mean nothing's there? Or is it because the party that controls Congress, that controls the presidency, has it happened under Bush and now under Obama for a time, and certainly partially true today? The lack of inactivity seems to validate government activity, certainly at the executive branch. If there's no controversy, there's no oversight. And Congress generally is uninterested in doing the hard work of oversight. They're busy trying to stay in office. They're busy trying to raise money to stay in office. And they're busy trying to get press for their activities. Sometimes that coincides with effective oversight. Many times it doesn't, obviously. I think a good example of the lack, why we can't rely on Congress for oversight is the recent scandal over those meetings run by the General Services Administration. where they're having these high-priced conferences in Las Vegas and other places. And of course, Congress holds its hearing screaming about this money and the expense after the fact. But that's not oversight. That is not oversight. Congress is as responsible for making sure that doesn't happen from the get-go as the GSA administrators who were actually responsible for those expenses. Congressional oversight means making sure the money is being spent wisely to begin with, and running and yelling at these agencies years after you appropriated funds and figuring out, well, maybe those funds weren't being spent wisely. It makes a joke of the effective stewardship of taxpayer funds that Congress is supposed to serve as. So these are the problems that we're facing, an ideological and uninterested media, a Congress that's ineffective for a variety of reasons. But the good news is folks are stepping into the oversight gap. I'd like to think Judicial Watch is stepping into the oversight gap. And we're also joined by representatives of the new media. I think that may be overstating it, because the folks have been around for a while now, these institutions we're talking about, to talk about where it is that we can be doing better jobs in terms of investigating the Obama administration, maybe government activity general, certainly on the congressional side of things, and doing the work that Congress is not able to do. And I know Judicial Watch is able to do this. We have nearly 1,000 FOIA requests under the Freedom of Information Act and nearly 100 lawsuits seeking access to government information excuse me, from the Obama administration. And I know, as a result of our lawsuits, that Congress gets information that they've been fighting about that they've been unable to get. And the difference between Congress getting information and Judicial Watch getting information is that the congressional process is a political process. Even if there's a subpoena outstanding, even if there's a government a letter from a chairman that requires under law a response, the negotiations about that response is political. Those negotiations are political. The documents that Congress gets isn't necessarily they're not necessarily all public to folks who want information too. So Congress may get information from the executive branch that never sees the light of day. But again, the process is inherently political. But when Judicial Watch and other outside independent entities sue for information, there's a more regular legal process that guarantees certainly disclosure that is not only public, but accountable in a court of law, as opposed to accountable to a panel of politicians. So as a result, we can be very effective in getting access to that information. A good example is the controversy recently over the film Zero Dark 30, where the Obama administration, it looks like, gave inappropriate access to the filmmakers of Zero Dark 30, which is the film about the bin Laden raid and killing, and kept that access secret. And that access, it looks like it was given, was because the Obama administration thought the filmmakers were going to make a film about Obama, a big Obama victory, obviously, the killing of bin Laden just shortly before the election. So we got documents that showed, provided details about this inappropriate access and showed that they may have actually been giving them classified information, as initial reports suggested. Now, the media didn't get this information. Congress didn't get this information. Judicial Watch got this information. And Congress erupted, some in Congress erupted like Peter King, but based on the information that Judicial Watch was able to obtain, a Department of Defense Inspector General's investigation was begun, and now just recently we learned that based on information Judicial Watch disclosed to the American people, a criminal referral has been made to the Department of Justice about this activity. And you know, Judicial Watch is happy to do the work, but it ought to be very disconcerting to our audience that, frankly, if but for Judicial Watch and maybe 3 or 4 watchdog organizations and interested media, none of this would have seen the light of day. This is the sort of thing our institutional media ought to be doing, and this is the sort of thing our Congress ought to be doing. But we're happy to stand in the gap as we're discussing. Now, to be fair to the big media, there are some folks out there individually who do good work. The Washington Post did great work exposing some of the details of the Solyndra scandal. CBS News, one reporter over there, Ms. Atkinson, did great work, as Matthew knows, exposing some of the Fast and Furious details. But to me, those exceptions kind of prove the rule that a lot of the other media is falling down on the job on effective oversight of a government that is, frankly, off the rails in terms of its willingness to do whatever it wants to do without being held to account in the law or in Congress or in the media. So we're pleased to be aided in our examination of this issue by three great reporters who are doing the hard work that so much of Washington isn't doing. Matthew, at the far end of our panel, is Matthew Boyle, who's an investigative journalist now with Breitbart News. He previously worked for the Daily Caller and specializes in complex government corruption stories. He's uncovered waste, fraud, and abuse and illegal activity in government and has turned up scandals where the mainstream media wouldn't look. He's been at the forefront of the investigation of Operation Fast and Furious, writing hundreds of stories.
I think it's probably like close to 300 or 400 stories that I've written on Fast and Furious.
Prompting Eric Holder to go crazy and to excuse him of being behind the congressional calls for his resignation. And Boyle's led the coverage on many other Obama scandals, including the Obamacare waivers, the Delphi pension debacle, Light Squared, and the Solyndra scandals as well. And Vince Coglianese, excuse me. Vince Coglianese is a senior online editor for the Daily Caller and the host of the Daily Caller podcast. His reporting has received wide coverage, including the pages of the New York Times, the Journal, the Washington Post, and the Drudge Report, among others. And Vince has been all over the media talking about his investigative reporting, including on Fox and CNN. And not only that, but he does the radio side of the ledger. He's been a talk show host down in North Carolina. And the Daily Caller, in addition to Breitbart News, is some of the more recent entrants to the kind of the aggressive, forget about the old way of looking at government operations attitude that the rest of the media has. And, someone I think who can help us bridge the kind of the connection between the way the old media operates and the way this new innovative media is operating is Richard Pollack, who is a reporter with the Special Investigative Reporting Unit of the Washington Examiner. And he's here from Mark Tapscott, who unfortunately was unable to attend. But we will do well with Richard here today for us, I can tell you that. He's the former Washington Bureau Chief for PJ Media, and he spent nearly a decade with ABC News as Washington producer for Good Morning America, and he also served as senior producer for Fox News Sunday with Tony Snow. And so the way our panel is going to work, thank you for all joining us, is that our participants will make some presentations and remarks. We'll talk a little bit amongst ourselves up here, and then invite you to join the conversation as well. And if you have cell phones or other noise-making devices, put them on silent or vibrate or whatever it is you can, so the panel is not disrupted unnecessarily. But with that, we will start with Richard, and then perhaps just work our way down the panel. Richard Paul.
Thank you very much, and thank you to Judicial Watch for, again, putting together really innovative programming with respect to investigative reporting and also just how to dig into this city, this really opaque series of bureaucracies, agencies, and departments. I'm honored to be part of the new Washington Examiner Watchdog Group, which is a special group that Mark Tapscott, who unfortunately couldn't be here, but Mark has established. It is a aggressive, enterprising, investigative journalism unit of 4 people, and we're just getting started. We were established earlier this year, and I'm very happy to be part of it and be part of a team, a growing team, I think, of very aggressive and very creative and dogged reporters that are emerging in Washington. When I, not to date myself too much, but there was in the 1970s this idea of what was called new journalism. And new journalism was where you weren't just looking at where problems were, wherever they are. You really brought to the table a partisanship, your own values, they would say. And I think that distorted and destroyed the legacy media, if you want to call it that. I think that rather than look at government or look at wrongdoing wherever it might be, they began to have an agenda. And as a result, we see the kind of distorted reporting that we have today. I think on the congressional issue, the issue of congressional oversight, I think that with the exception of Chairman Issa, I think that there is very little going on in terms of genuine investigation. Energy and Commerce looked at Solyndra for a while, but they have not been very assertive or proactive, in my opinion. And it's very interesting because when Issa was assuming the chairmanship, the New York Times and the Washington Post were wringing their hands about what kind of devil this man was, what kind of evil would he actually undertake. And they really attributed all sorts of terrible agendas, a tsunami of investigations. And in fact, I think that Issa has been very, very modest in what he has done. I think that he could have been very, very assertive, and he's been one of the few, I think, shining lights on the Hill. But even he has been somewhat restrained, in my opinion. I think we're entering what I would call the third phase of the Obama administration. The first phase was one in which there was a victorious, euphoric Democratic Party and White House staff that saw that there were no bounds. I mean, they owned both basically the House and the Senate. They were hungry for power after being in the wilderness for a long time, and they were very over the top in terms of the kind of cronyism, the kinds of favoritism, the kinds of backroom deals that they were putting together, and there was a tremendous amount of arrogance that accompanied this first phase. And to a certain extent, a little bit of it was moderated after the loss of the House in the 2010 election. And I think that the second phase, though, started in earnest a little about 15 months before the election, because for the first time, I think that the Obama people were under the gun, they were defensive, they saw the different scandals that were evolving, and I think that Democrats who were vulnerable were sending a signal to the Obama White House to cool it, because they thought that they would be at risk if they continued with this aggressiveness. And so I think the second phase leading up to the election was one in which there was a lot of restraint. Some people may not think it's a lot of restraint, but there was, relative to the first phase, I think that they were restrained. And now we have an unelected, a president who will not be facing re-election. And I think that we're seeing the third phase, which is, I think, a reoccurrence of the arrogance that we saw in the beginning. And I think that it's going to be a great challenge for those of us who are really trying to keep up with the kind of favoritism, the backroom deals, and the illegal activities, I think, that will be undertaken. Just a couple of other thoughts. I think that that when you look at different major events and lots of money going toward it, that's a signal that you should take a look at what's going on. So, for example, we are investigating FEMA after Hurricane Sandy, and we are uncovering quite a bit of corruption within the agency, both in terms of the Sandy response, but also in terms of institutional corruption, and you're going to be seeing more of that unfold in the Examiner pages. I think that the upcoming inauguration is one in which we want to undertake a lot of scrutiny. Who's paying for the inauguration? What kind of favors are they expecting in return? What kinds of bundlers and other campaign donors are putting money, but how about new money? And what kind of quid pro quo might we be seeing there? So I think that this is going to be a very tough time. I think that they are really quite aggressive. I think that the issue of EPA Administrator Lisa Jackson alias EPA account is probably only one of many alias accounts that Obama administration officials have had throughout the administration. And I think that
that was just a mistake.
That was.
She chose a man's name for no reason whatsoever.
That's right. That's right. Richard. Right.
Richard.
My
right.
name.
Yeah. That was right.
And
yeah.
I felt put upon.
It's criminal.
Exactly. But I think that they're going to. I just think that there are a lot of insidious things and a lot of plans that are being hatched today with a newfound arrogance. I mean, to a certain extent, we see a little bit of it in terms of the president's approach toward the fiscal cliff negotiations, if that's what they are. I mean, there's a real arrogance that he is showing toward this, and no one's calling him on it. No one. Very few are calling him on it. And I think that beneath the surface, this arrogance is manifesting itself in new cylinders and new programs that it'll take us years to be able to uncover. So I want to thank you again for putting this together and doing the great work that you guys have done, and leave it to my two colleagues to add some good thoughts.
Okay, Vince, I want you to solve the problem now.
I'll try
Your
not to.
turn. Thank you.
Thank you, Tom, for having us all here, and it's always a pleasure. I've been speaking to some people beforehand that it's always a pleasure to talk about investigative journalism because it's very stimulating to have this discussion, to sometimes sit back and discuss how we go about our business, and it's nice to sit next to people like Richard and have a conversation with somebody who's done it for so long to be able to kind of reinvigorate that passion. Because investigative journalism actually can be kind of hard. And, it's in journalism, I kind of divide it up between, if you cover the day-to-day, which goes on in the world, you usually sleep pretty well at night because you're done with your story, it's out, you go to bed, and you're like, hey, no big deal, whatever happens tomorrow, I'm going to cover it. But with investigative journalism, there's sometimes a lot of restless nights, and I know a lot of people in this room have experienced this, where you're wondering if that document's going to come back, you're wondering if the rabbit you've been chasing is headed in the right direction or not. You wonder, especially for us journalists, you wonder if a source will come through, if you'll be able to finally get in touch with that person that you for so long have been trying to pursue. So investigative journalism can be hard and trying work, but it's totally worth it. And I believe it's where journalism outlets will distinguish themselves in terms of going forward into being, like, what are the most successful new media ventures? Those who do original reporting. Because at the end of the day, there's going to be a million websites who all aggregate each other's work, who try and talk about what everybody else is doing, and obviously we engage in some of that. We rely on Judicial Watch to be one of those fixtures that is looking into the Obama administration. But ultimately, you have to be doing it on your own. That's what will make you, just as a business model, that's how you'll succeed. To give you a little background on me, I'm the senior online editor for the Daily Caller, so I spend an inordinate amount of time writing the wittiest headline I can possibly think of for many of the stories that we have. But also, when I get
You're the one.
I'm the guy.
Okay.
Blame me. My email's on the website. You can send the email there. But also, I've had the luxury of spending some time doing some investigations this year. Two of my favorite have been, at the beginning of the year, I joined my boss, Tucker Carlson, in doing an investigation into Media Matters for America, which is a liberal organization that is principally running cover for the president and trying to hit media outlets whenever they go in a direction that doesn't assist the platform of the Democratic Party. So their effort is to try and get them to tack to the left, no matter how they're covering it. And they've had some success. Our research yielded some very intriguing things, including that they have a relationship with the White House. They carry on weekly conference calls with the White House. Their principal leadership has met at the White House with Valerie Jarrett, of all people, and many of you know she is largely considered to be the person who pulls the strings in the White House. So there was a lot involved in that piece that certainly took a while. I believe the investigation, Matthew was there, he saw me, we have a newsroom, I ducked out into like a separate office for a couple months just to put my head down and figure out this story, and I think it took 2 months or so of reporting. But it finally came out. We were very pleased with how it came out. It was widely panned by the institutional press. They didn't like it, especially because many members of the press were named in it. Media Matters said that that there were reporters around this town and in New York who were amenable to their hits, would take what they wrote, what they sent them, and produce it as journalism themselves. So there was a lot of defensiveness in the media. You'll find anytime you go after the media itself, there's a lot of circling the wagons. But we're okay with that. We have an instinct, I think, that's unique, and I think that I speak for everyone at this table, that is that we don't instinctively suck up to power. And it's sort of, I think, what Tom was getting at to begin with, which is that when you're covering the government, ultimately a lot of these reporters do get very close. They're working on source development. They want these people to give them things, and that often means that the people that are closest to these guys are the ones who are probably not going to cover them the most critically. And it's a difficult balancing act, but it's one that needs to be undertaken. And so we try and do that. I can say, just using the Media Matters experience to kind of, because I know a lot of you are here to talk about like how is it that you go about investigative reporting. I can say that you should spend a lot of time reading the documents that no one else does. It's easy to read news stories about what's going on in the world, but that's because somebody else already did the work and got it to you. So what next? Look through, especially in the case of like an organization like Media Matters, this is a tax-exempt organization, so they have to file a Form 990 every year to the IRS explaining what their activities were that year, how they spent their money, how much their leadership is getting paid. Look into those things. Those things can yield some interesting results. Find out what groups they spend a lot of time giving contracts to, and you can begin to see the web that is formed in Washington between various organizations. In that case in particular, we went and we sent a request to the IRS, which has to be done in a separate way, because I can walk into any 501c3 and ask for their Form 990, and they have to provide it on demand. That's true of anybody in this room, by the way. As a citizen, you can do this. And but there's also ways to pursue how they applied for their tax-exempt status to the IRS. There's a separate form that you have to send to the IRS, and eventually they'll get you a response. And what we found, which was intriguing, was that Media Matters declared that they needed to turn back Christian thinking in the United States and in the media in their IRS application. Now, it never said anything about this anywhere else on their website. You can't see this in their mission statement. We're going after Christians. But in the IRS tax application, for whatever reason, the seed of the idea was like, there's a Christian-dominated media, and we have to turn this back. Interesting, and we thought worth reporting. That relationship actually extended, and Matthew Boyle will maybe can speak on this a little bit or can give me an assist here. Matt, as I think has been mentioned, was recently with the Daily Caller, and we've sent a Freedom of Information Act request to the Justice Department in 2011, near the end of 2011, and we didn't receive our timely response on it. We're supposed to get, what is it, Tom? 30 days is what they're, it's up, whatever. More or less. That they're supposed to get back to us with some response.
They waited 9 months to answer the document request, and they finally, when it came through, it was hardcore evidence. I forget exactly how many pages, and it wasn't even a full response either, but it was something like 50, 60 pages worth of emails between the Department of Justice's communication director, Eric Holder's-Flack, and Media Matters for America, coordinating how to
spin press,
not only spin press, but how to demonize whistleblowers, attack me. Congressman Darrell Isaac describes it as Barack Obama's enemies list, and that's what it is. It's a list of people and targets that they want to eliminate and destroy the reputations of. And that the Department of Justice is colluding with a far left-wing advocacy organization that has no interest in truth to destroy our reputation.
And at its base, when we finally looked at that, we said, look, the press office of the Department of Justice, its responsibility is to talk to the American people. I mean, that's the whole point of the press, is to bring this information to the American people. And when you have, in this case, a left-wing advocacy group working to formulate some sort of spin on what should just be basic information, that's a problem, and worthy of our investigation. One other thing that I worked on this year, and I can speak on this a little bit later because I've already kind of spoken in depth about the Media Matters thing, is the 2007 video of Obama at Hampton University that caused much ire in the press prior to the first debate is when we released it. Some of you may remember it. And that took a bit of time as well to work on. I'd like to what was the substance of that video?
Yeah, what was the headline from that one?
That was this was a video that received very little attention in 2007. It was actually as much a media story as it was one about the president, and he was speaking to black ministers in Hampton University in Virginia, and he was it was actually a very different president than we've seen in almost any situation, and certainly pandering to the base that he had present there. But also, he spoke again very highly of Reverend Jeremiah Wright. This was 6 months or so after he had already established distance from him and told him he couldn't be a part of the launch of his campaign because the campaign was concerned with the appearance of Wright being present. The other, which by the way, anytime you mention Wright, the media will outright dismiss the story because it's old news and it's actually not worth talking about anymore. We've been down this road. We know he's crazy. We don't have to talk about it anymore. The other is that he made a case that the reason New Orleans wasn't receiving as much federal assistance, which was completely untrue by the time he said this, was because New Orleans is majority black. He made the case that it was a racist issue, and it simply wasn't true. There's a Stafford Act. The Stafford Act provides this emergency money, and often the local communities have to give about 10%. That's often the number that's settled on of that money for the recovery, and the government offers the other 90%. And typically, in major disasters, the federal government will waive the cost sharing requirement for these local locations. Just weeks before Obama gave that speech, he voted against giving an exemption to New Orleans for the Stafford Act. Well, we thought that was interesting, so we reported it, and certainly caught a lot of flack for talking about old news. The only press coverage, by the way, from 2007 involved reading from Obama's prepared remarks, which were distinctly different from the remarks as delivered. And he diverted in a very substantive way, one that would have earned the attention, hopefully, of most of the press had they been paying attention at the time. Finally, just on the issues that we're continuing to investigate now, and we've placed a lot of focus on at the Daily Caller, is in welfare spending. Certainly, and I would say if you're not following Caroline May either on Twitter or on her author page on the Daily Caller, you should be.
She's a writer with the Caller?
That's correct. She's a writer for the Daily Caller. She's doing tremendous work in investigating how welfare money, chiefly one of the biggest things she found out recently is that immigrants, often the immigration program is meant to bring in people that won't come in and become wards of the state. Well, you should tell the welfare programs, because they're not being told that, because they're giving whole advertising packets on how to get on welfare as soon as you come into the country. Well, that's pretty amazing, and certainly it's American citizens who want to know that. The other is that when you say that illegal immigrants are tapping welfare resources, oftentimes reflexive government defenders will tell you, well, no, that's not true. It's illegal for them to do that. But when they say that, they're often referring to only two programs, TANF and the supplemental security income programs, where it is markedly illegal. But that doesn't mean there's not, one, abuse, but two, there's 83 welfare programs that, by our count, that exist besides these two. I mean, there's so many opportunities where somebody can come in contact with the system and get access to government assistance in millions of ways. So we're going to continue to look in that and just see to what extent how basically waste, fraud, and abuse. That's the continued.
Just to clarify, TANF is the temporary
assistance for needy families,
which is welfare as it used to be.
Right, and the welfare that received the scrutiny of welfare reform in the early 90s.
Well, one of the sad things about what goes on in Washington is all the waste, fraud, and abuse, and Tom Coburn or William Proxmire in the old days, and you talk about these wasteful programs, and it's like a joke. When it's reported on, it's seen, well, isn't it government funny the way it wastes our money, as opposed to the outrage that really we ought to have about people's hard-earned money being wasted in these forms. Matthew, finish out for us.
I want to say thank you, Tom, for having this panel. I think it's very important that we talk about this kind of stuff because it is overlooked very often. You mentioned outrage. Well, where is the outrage? This administration has gotten away with so much illegal activity and so much waste, fraud, abuse. There are people who have violated the law who are all throughout this administration, and nobody is held accountable. A perfect example of that is Kathleen Sebelius. She violated the Hatch Act. That's a normally fireable offense immediately. Somebody is supposed to be fired from their job, yet she's still there. I don't know why. And I don't know why the people on Capitol Hill aren't outraged about this.
Which is to campaign on the government's dime.
Right. That's what she was doing. Is in a speech in North Carolina, she was where she was acting as the HHS secretary in her official government capacity, endorsed two candidates for public office. That was President Barack Obama's reelection and Walter Dalton for governor in a gubernatorial race. That is illegal. The United States Office of Special Counsel found her in violation of the Hatch Act. People who violate the Hatch Act are normally terminated, yet she still has a position in the federal government. She is still the Secretary of Health and Human Services. It doesn't make any sense. Where is the outrage on Capitol Hill? That's another thing, is that why are there not, you would figure that in a situation like that Republicans would be screaming she should be fired because that's what happens to people who violate the Hatch Act. Well, for whatever reason, they're not, whatever political interest they have at the time. Obviously, when this all came to light, there was an ongoing presidential election, and it must not have been in the political interest of the powers that be that were running against the president at the time. But at the same time, there is a massive lack of oversight. We can talk all about how there are all these problems, but I think it's better to talk about how to solve them. I think, have you ever heard the phrase, if you see something, say something? We need whistleblowers to come out of the federal government. There are a lot of good people who work in all these different agencies in the federal government who see what's going on. They know that it's wrong, but they don't know what to do about it. A perfect example of this is what happened in Operation Fast and Furious. That's a scandal that I've gone after pretty hard personally, but Fast and Furious never would have been broken out there at all, ever, if it weren't for a courageous ATF agent who had the guts to call Congress and talk to them about it. And he didn't know where to go when this came out. This ATF agent, of course, is John Dodson. He was one of the people who was involved in the operation. He was trying to raise people's concerns and suspicions about this as it was going on. He complained internally. He told his bosses it was wrong. He told the Justice Department it was wrong. He told the OIG it was wrong. He tried to get people inside the Justice Department to learn about this. And by the way, Eric Holder says that he launched his own internal investigation. That's false. It was actually ATF agent John Dodson who notified the Inspector General first, and that's how they launched their investigation into it after Congress got involved. But the point is that he tried to notify people that this was wrong as it was ongoing before Brian Terry was murdered, before hundreds of Mexicans were murdered, and nobody did anything about it. So what we have to do is we have to find a way to encourage these people to come out and talk to us. There's got to be a way to do this. I know we're actively working on building bridges to these good people all throughout the federal government. Another example. You need to kind of have an idea on where to look for stuff that's going on. If you start to see things, if you notice something, there's no such thing as a coincidence. So if you start seeing things hitting, the reason why I went after and tried to get those documents between the Justice Department and Media Matters that we were talking about earlier is because I started noticing that Media Matters was within instance of me sending a press request into the Justice Department to try to figure out an answer to a certain question, which, by the way, if Tracy Schmaler, the Department of Justice spokeswoman, spent an eighth of the amount of time that she did colluding with a far left-wing organization to smear the reputations of whistleblowers and people in the press, actually answering questions, we probably wouldn't have had to get to the point where Eric Holder was held in criminal and civil contempt of Congress and that there were hundreds of members of Congress demanding his immediate resignation. That said, it did get to that point, and one of the reasons why I even filed that FOIA request in the first place is because I started noticing that the Media Matters was really fast with how they knew what I was going after. And so I figured that they were trying to get, that they had to have, it didn't seem that they were that smart. They're not that smart. So, they can't be. So we know that, we can rule that out. So somebody has to be telling them what to do. So, who is that person that's telling them what to do? Eric Holder, spokeswoman. So, and I figured I would file a FOIA request for that. In addition to that, we need to get evidence. We have to get documents, testimony, and evidence to actually do something about this. We know there's a lot of waste, fraud, and abuse going on. There's a lot of illegal activity going on. We need documents, we need pictures, we need videos, we need photographs, we need people to come out and talk about it, because if we don't get that stuff, we can't do anything about it, and nobody's ever held accountable. So we have to find ways to build bridges into these government agencies and find ways to get stuff out of them. We depend on whistleblowers, we depend on the Freedom of Information Act, we depend on congressional oversight. Can be good at times, it cannot be good at other times, and depending on what they're interested in at the time. But that's what we need. We need evidence to be able to prove what we already know to be true. And I think.
Well, thank you, Matthew. It occurs to me, if I could do a plug for our book and movie, the book, The Corruption Chronicles, and the movie, The District of Corruption. Matthew appears in that, and I know Mark is in the movie as well. We look at the book, it was done in July, the movie was finished shortly before the election, and we're thinking, well, what's here that, is there a second life? And I thought, well, none of these questions have answers related to corruption in the Obama administration. So the category of scandals, whether it be Fast and Furious or the green energy scandals or the collaboration between the Department of Justice and these left-wing groups in attacking election integrity or attacking you, what of those categories of Obama scandals that are still hanging out there, what would you recommend in terms of a focus where there's significantly more fruitful investigation to be done versus, well, we kind of know what's out there already and we need to take steps to just hold people to account for what we know?
I would say that one scandal and this is something that I've been digging into pretty heavily over the past several months, but still needs a lot of work to be done. And I think that there is at the end of at the end of this, there is a pot of gold at the end of the rainbow. Is that I do think that there is evidence that Timothy Geithner violated the law with regard to the bailout, and specifically with regard to how the Treasury Department took away the pensions of 20,000 non-union workers and topped up the pensions of every union worker involved in the bailout. I know coming on the way on that is by the way, there are 3 congressional committees investigating that. They're all kind of crossing over each other and not really getting anywhere. But, I mean, I can tell you that I've been able to get all these different documents that certainly suggest that a lot of these people involved in the bailout did violate the law, and that the bailout wasn't a massive saving of the auto industry. In addition to just that Delphi part of the bailout hasn't been fully explored. It was a crony capitalism nightmare. And I think we have to get more evidence about what happened there, because I don't think the American people have the truth about what happened during the auto bailout.
All of that is such a perfect example. Our government's running as nationalized 2 car companies.
Mm-hmm.
Any oversight of that? Taking over effectively the mortgage market through the nationalization of Fannie and Freddie, through FHA. Any interest in that? You can't get a mortgage unless it's through the government or eventually backed by the government. Any interest in that? Hundreds of billions still continue to go out under TARP, and we know the Fed has been bailing out Europe to the tune of billions of dollars a day. Any interest in that? The unbridled socialism, to put it bluntly, of this administration and partly of the last days of the last administration, there's virtually no oversight in all that extra government activity. That's for sure. Vince, what's your thought on what things that are hanging out there that really need more thorough vetting?
Well, I mean, I refer back to Caroline May's efforts to investigate welfare and how that system's either being abused or misused by the government, and also all these programs come to mind, and you talked about the bailout. I keep thinking back to Republicans had some focus on Solyndra for a little bit, which was symptomatic of a larger problem, which was the Department of Energy had all these loan guarantees for green energy firms, and certainly we've seen failure after failure after failure come out, and all this money that the United States will never recoup from organizations that have failed. And what was this organization, A123? Like last week, this green energy firm that received government backing, and all of a sudden China swoops in and buys it up? What? Do you think the taxpayers if we could go on for hours. I mean, you mentioned that some of the institutional media has done some good work. One of the ones that really sticks out to me this year was, I think, both 60 Minutes and The Atlantic gave special attention to the amount of insider trading that has been going on in Congress, and that they were able to do with impunity. Meaning, these guys show up to Congress, all of a sudden they have access to every decision that's forthcoming about what the government's going to do, and they're making stock purchases and sales based on that knowledge. And this is not illegal. Now, you can make the case that maybe insider trading shouldn't be illegal at all. Maybe, and I've seen some people go in that direction. But we should at least know that, because you've had people, and Republicans and Democrats, who showed up to Congress, very poor people, and left very wealthy.
Well,
and
the speaker included.
Yeah, the speaker included. I think I don't want to.
The chairman of the House Financial Services Committee, Spencer Bachus, loaded his pockets. It's the only person that of all the people that Andrew Breitbart ever went after, it's the only person that he ever called for his resignation. And of course, Spencer Bachus is still there.
He made our top 10 corrupt politicians list a year or two.
So when people say, well, we shouldn't pay our politicians, we should just don't take a salary. Oh, that'd be very generous of them, because they're still going to make millions. I mean, it's like, so anyway.
Well, and the funny thing about the insider trading scandal, it was Peter Schweitzer who independently came up with that, and 60 Minutes and the other publications wrote on that. And, of course, insider trading was already illegal, so what did Congress do in response to the scandal? Passed a law to make it illegal again. So don't worry, that's taken care of. Richard, I want you to answer my question generally, and talk a little bit more about, I know the focus of Mark and you guys, on tracking the new innovations in Internet transparency that the Obama administration, I guess, has half-heartedly pursued, but has provided interesting leads and opportunities for folks, not only for journalists to do, but for citizens to do as well in terms of tracking government spending.
Well, I think that one of to answer your first question, one of the most interesting areas that I think we've only touched the surface on is the alliance between the Obama administration and venture capitalists, or purported venture capitalists in Silicon Valley. And whether you're talking about Tesla, or you're talking about Solyndra, or you're talking about SpaceX, these are all, at one time, so-called self-made entrepreneurs who were interested in getting good ideas and being able to be an incubator for them. And then, even under the Bush administration, some money began to become available, but really the Obama administration, I think, has raised it to a new art form. And as a result, this money, that is taxpayer money, is underwriting a tremendous number of so-called public-private ventures in which the federal government finances anywhere from 60 to 90% of it, and they only have to put up 10%. And many of these, of course, are bundlers or supporters of the president. But there is a whole new tectonic shift, so to speak, between the folks in Silicon Valley and those in Washington. There really is an alliance. And the money continues to flow unabated, unexamined, I might add, by either the Capitol Hill or many of the members of the media. And I think this is a very rich area that needs to be mined. And we have a couple of stories in development right now that will turn your stomachs, and I'm afraid to say. But I think that Tim Carney, one of our columnists at the Examiner, said that one of the ways to really get people to look at government and government spending is to take a look at the crony capitalism, the private deals, the side deals, the favoritism that takes place, the political insider relationships. And that kind of thing will turn the public off to the question of government spending. On the other hand, the public rather, is interested in genuine government programs that will help in certain particular ways, whether it's a disadvantaged or the poor. And I think that there's probably large public support for that. However, when you take a look at how pervasive these billions and trillions of dollars are being transferred over to a already rich class of politically favored elites, I think that it turns the stomach of the public, and this is the hallmark, in my opinion, of this administration. Democrats and Republicans have been interested in crony capitalism and in political favors forever. So this is a bipartisan problem. But I really believe the Obama people have raised it to an art form. I will just say one thing, and that is about the issue of the Internet. We have on staff, Mark Tapscott, the executive editor of the Examiner, has brought in sort of a high-level data cruncher to go into all of the databases that are available and really trying to sift it out. Because in addition to whether you see something that's a coincidence, and it probably isn't a coincidence, following your nose and your instincts is very important in this business. But there's also, numbers don't lie. Numbers and paper trails are really quite effective. And the databases there are really out there, and I would say that Darrell Issa is one of those people who has fought vigorously to change usaspending.gov and to change many of the other programs. And this administration has handed over large amounts of data that just sits there, and very few people really look into it. So I'll just say that in a very general, broad.
I would say that, if I could add just one thing, I mean, the Obama administration, as we've mentioned, has had the capacity to try and dissemble and delay getting information out there. But on the other hand, there are some things that they have done that as reporters actually makes our lives a little easier in rooting out some of the corruption. I mean, they are showing their hand sometimes. It's a behemoth of a government, and oftentimes information does get out that is useful for us to be able to do these investigations. I mean, spend any time looking at a White House visitors logs, and eventually you're going to start thinking to yourself, well, this is interesting, and you'll start looking up names. Granted, it'll be months before you'll actually begin to see visitors logs that are probably relevant in the days past. But, I mean, it is a start. There are things out there, and as, there are databases out there where you can start going through. And certainly the press is more involved in going tit for tat usually than it is in looking back at things that have already happened even a week prior.
If I could make a point or two before we open it up to questions from the audience. I think we would be hard-pressed to find previous examples of American history of a president joking and bemoaning the fact that he's not a dictator. I can't bypass Congress, even though I'd like to. I'm not a king, even though you'd all like me to be. Isn't that terrible? To have the head of a Republican form of government joke about that is just, I think, very extraordinary. But on top of that, when you tie it into his unilateral acts, his usurpation of the legislative functions of Congress, and his implementation of his policy agenda, that to me is the crisis of constitutional government that the media and the Congress, frankly, is largely ignoring. And you can point out his illegal recess appointments, his illicit recess appointments, where Congress says they're not in recess, and he says, you are in recess, so I'm going to make an appointment. Or his telling his supporters at one point, well, I can't rewrite immigration law and legalize all these people who are here under the DREAM Act concept, where young people supposedly would be legalized who are here legally. And then he goes ahead and does that. His refusal to support the Defense of Marriage Act in court, and then the response saying, after the election, the quote in the Washington Post by a senior Obama advisor, why you should read the big media, because the big media reports things that would outrage everyone else, but they think is just standard government operating procedure, and provides leads for the rest of us to find out the truth behind, where he says, the advisor says, well, what Obama did in areas that Tom Fitton's complaining about, he didn't say it like that, he said that's the new normal. That's going to be the new normal in the second Obama term, that where he's just taking things on his own and rewriting the law as he sees fit to implement.
Tell that to all the people who've been clamoring for some sort of answer to marijuana laws over the past few years.
Well, in immigration, and I think you're going to see I think that's certainly going to be down the pike on gun rights, where he's going to be restricting gun rights through fiat as opposed to he can't get anything to
Also,
Congress.
pay attention to the language, by the way. Like, every word that these guys say, especially the president, he comes out yesterday and has his press conference on gun rights. Pay attention when he's talking about how we need to address culture in this country. And I think a lot of people would agree with that just on a de facto basis, that sometimes culture, whatever direction culture is going, it can be damaging. But when the president of the United States starts talking about culture, it's worthy to say, okay, I'm going to pay attention to this because what does that mean? What does it mean in terms of government's role in regulating culture? I think that's worth looking at.
I agree.
To add to that too is that this is war. You really have to go and fight these people. They are trying to fundamentally change this country in a direction that it is not supposed to go. And you have to go and stop them. And the way to do so is, like I said, we need evidence, we need documents, we need videos, we need photos, and anything that we can do to help. This is not just us up here fighting. Everybody out there that's watching, everybody in this room is also fighting with us, and we have to stop them.
Richard?
And let me just add about this issue of, I would say dictatorial rule, but I find it really amazing that the president has unabashedly said that he would like Congress to waive over the next 4 years the right to approve the debt limit. Now, the raising the debt limit was created by the founding fathers because there was a real fear about the nation getting into debt by an executive or by fiat. And so they said that Congress, and only Congress, could establish the debt limit and raise it. This is a historic part of our country. It's the fabric of our country. Here is a president standing up and saying, I want to throw away 250 years of history of the way that we pay, we decide to pay for our government. And have we heard any kind of criticism from the mainstream press?
And his
it's just sort of like, oh, well, it's a negotiating tactic.
His argument is a little lazy, too, because when he had the opportunity, he voted against raising the debt ceiling when he was in the Senate. And secondly, just because Congress has lazily, ceremonially every year voted to raise the debt ceiling without an issue, isn't some sort of a mandate that it always be a lazy process. I mean, the whole reason they do it is because they're supposed to pay attention to it.
And part of the reason why the mainstream media doesn't report this and isn't outraged about it is because the White House is telling them not to be. So what we need to get, and this is where we come in, and this is where everybody else that can think about this comes in, is that we have to go and get those emails between the White House and the mainstream media, because they exist. I guarantee you, they're there. Eric Schultz from the White House and other spokespeople that work there, Jay Carney even, I guarantee you, Jen Psaki, they're all telling the reporters, oh, this is no big deal. This is no big deal. We need to get those emails and banner them across the top of all of our websites, because they won't do it because the White House is telling them not to.
Are they communicating through the so-called alias emails to get around
Absolutely,
the
and that's
FOIA
another
request?
thing that they're doing. And but like I said, these documents exist. These people are pretty stupid in the administration, and they do use email quite a bit.
Well, we need to move to the audience, and I want to make just two final quick points that follow up on you all. You're talking about Media Matters, but the idea there's a huge opportunity for investigation and exposure of the collaboration and collusion between the left and big government, and specifically, obviously, the Obama administration, whether it be the Department of Justice with these Acorn and the Acorn rump groups on voter integrity or lack of voter integrity, undermining the election integrity, or the funding of the EPA, of the left-wing groups that go ahead and then sue the EPA. The right always says, well, why is it these leftists are always so effective? And it's because they're working with the government, either sitting at the table, recommending hires, or actually getting money that they can then use to advance their agenda. And finally, the end point, it seems to me, for the violations of law are criminal investigations. And I know conservatives have kind of a distrust of these independent counsels or special counsels that come up, but the left has used them effectively to, when they thought the law was violated, they could have been disingenuous as to whether they thought it was a serious violation of law or an actual violation of law, but they put their money where their mouth was. They said there needs to be a criminal investigation. It's a perfect example is Solyndra. Solyndra, it seems to me, is a case closed. We know the White House was involved. We know, based on public reports, that Solyndra was told to not announce the firing of their employees prior to an election cycle, prior to an election date. And we know they were told that if they did it, their government funding was potentially at risk. That's the sort of stuff that gets people put in jail. Eric Holder, criminal investigation into the Fast and Furious, and
is there anything that he's done that
doesn't
warrant a criminal investigation?
Well, no, maybe
mean-
not. I mean, there are things that,
Yeah, I mean, basic run-of-the-mill stuff. I mean,
but
yeah,
there's
yeah.
run-of-the-mill corruption that you can get accountability through a person's resignation. And finally, Republicans are to blame for Obama corruption too. Eric Holder is Attorney General not because Obama wants him to be Attorney General, it's because Republicans allow him to remain as Attorney General. The leadership of the Senate and the House had said that Eric Holder can't be Attorney General anymore. They don't have to say it publicly, they can say it other ways. He would no longer be Attorney General. Same goes in instances like Kathleen Sebelius. There's not a cabinet official who serves, but for the sufferance of the Republican minority in the Senate and the Republican majority in the House. Think about that every time you hear a Republican scream about an official of the administration doing something wrong or right. And a perfect example of the impact of the Republicans' views on administration personnel policy is Susan Rice. There's a perfect example of someone who, in theory, could be the next Secretary of State because the Senate controls the House, the Senate is controlled by Democrats. But there was a committed Republican minority who decided that she was not going to become Secretary of State. And arguably, if it came to a vote, they would have lost that. But that's not the way Washington operates. And so we need to use politics as conservatives and concerned about government corruption and demand those who complain about government corruption, they take more aggressive action in that regard. So I blame Mitch McConnell and Speaker Boehner for Eric Holder being as much Attorney General as much as the others. And believe me, I've let the leadership representatives know where I think they should be on this issue, and Matthew, you've done all the reporting on that. Has the Speaker of the House called on his resignation?
No, Speaker of the House has not called on Attorney General Eric Holder's
Has Mitch
resignation.
McConnell called for
And
his
nor has
resignation?
Mitch McConnell, nor have many other members of leadership.
As the key leadership in the Judiciary Committee on the Republican side, and Senator
Not even
Grassley,
Darrell Issa has called for Eric Holder's resignation.
as the head of the Judiciary Committee on the Republican
Nope,
side and the
not
House
even
called for his
Senator Grassley
registration?
has called for his
Chuck Grassley, has he
No.
called for his
No.
registration? And I like Chuck Grassley. He was here a few months ago talking about, he did great work on Fast and Furious, but they've yet to pull the trigger on that issue, to use an awkward turn of phrase. So you said, but on that happy note, but there are opportunities. I mean, we're showing that there's a vehicle for doing these things, and we're providing the information out there. There is an opportunity for accountability, and you don't need a lot of resources in order to get that accountability. We show that. Peter Schweitzer, Government Accountability, shows that. Government Accountability Institute shows that. And the reporters sitting at this table show that. It doesn't need, you don't need to be 60 Minutes, you don't need to be ABC News to get this information out. Citizen activist groups can do it, and just hardworking reporters, young and old, can do it as well. So I want to open it up to questions. I'm going to take another 10 minutes or so for questions, and then we'll shut it down. But up front, if you could identify yourself. And I think we have a microphone so that folks on the internet can hear as well. So, and try to keep it to, if you have a question or comment.
Yeah. Jim Snyder from Isolin and the Edmund J. Soffer Center for Ethics at Harvard University. The question concerns how to leverage Congress's scarce oversight resources to maximum effect. So Tom early on talked about the difficulty, regardless of party affiliation, to motivate Congress to do effective oversight. And I'd say there's a general consensus in the political science community how difficult it is to get Congress to do effective oversight. So
a perfect example of that is Congressman Frank Wolf right now has a bill that would establish a special select committee to investigate the Benghazi scandal. It is a perfect scandal for there to be a special select committee to investigate. There are so many facets of government that are involved. The State Department's involved. The Justice Department's involved. The CIA is involved. Senior levels of the administration. The White House is involved. The Secretary, the Ambassador to the United Nations is involved. This is a perfect example of where you have all of these different congressional committees crossing over each other, running parallel or overlapping investigations that are not an efficient use of resources. A special select committee would take the chairman and ranking members of each of those committees that in the House that are investigating, and potentially in the Senate as well. You could do a bicameral committee as well, and pull the resources together, and then obviously the Speaker and or Senate Majority Leader would be able to appoint and Senate Minority Leader and House Minority Leader would be able to appoint representatives to this committee as well, Right now, the Speaker of the House is blocking the effort to implement a special select committee to investigate the Benghazi scandal. Once again, this is a place where there would be a perfect example of where this would happen. There are several people who support this effort. There are many members of Congress who want it, but the Speaker won't even let this bill go to the floor for a vote.
So anyway, just a second. That illustrates a motivation problem. But the specific question is there's sort of two strategies to approach this. One is direct oversight. The GSA scandal would be a vivid example. The other type of approach is to pass legislation to enable groups like Judicial Watch or POGO or whatnot to more effectively do oversight. So Darrell Iss's committee has done both. He pursued the GSA scandal, but he's also done the Disclose Act. Now, it's quite interesting. He's devoted far more staff time to the Disclose Act than the GSA, but in terms of popular coverage, there are hundreds of pages, for example, of column inches on the GSA scandal, including multiple front-page articles. There's only been a few sentences, including a Dana Milbank op-ed on the Disclose Act. What would have greater impact on enhancing oversight in preventing another GSA scandal? I would say the Disclose Act, which would allow your data journalists to really understand federal budgets in a way that has been inconceivable ever in the past. And the question is, there are many other types of empowering legislation. Why not focus on that? In your book, for example, you talk about the FOIA Act that made Judicial Watch possible. There's a whole other types of legislation. Mark Tapscott is a big fan of this type of legislation. Right. But it's just, you can't get your articles out there in visibility because people are interested in the GSA scandals and not this fundamental literature. But that's, I think, the way to leverage resources. And I wanted to get your thought.
I think you're right. I mean, FOIA can always be reformed. The deliberative process privilege, which for those of you who don't follow the Freedom of Information Act, not everything you ask for the government's required to give to you. And one of the biggest areas of exemption is deliberative process privilege, which is exactly the sort of thing you want. The back and forth before a decision is made. Oftentimes that back and forth is exempt from disclosure. Now, I'm greatly simplifying it. But, you know, that's an area that, you know, frankly, I think there ought to be more accountability about that back and forth. If someone has a criminal idea or a bad idea or a dishonest idea, well, we have a right to know if we're paying people to do that. And if it, you know, means that they are less likely to have and share bad ideas, well, so be it. That's the price for a Republican accountability. I mean Republican in a rule of law sense of the word. And, you know, in addition, we talk about the committee structure of Congress as being, you know, often the committees are acting in conflict. But better coordination among the committees in terms of that regard, and that's a leadership issue. But individual members are citizens too. And individual members too often defer to their chairman or to their leadership in terms of what issues they're going to take up, what issues they're going to use the power of their office. You know, we did not send members of Congress there just to sit on a specific committee and not do anything else. They can ask under the Freedom of Information Act. They can pressure government agencies independently. And I think we need to educate members of Congress about their abilities as individuals outside of the committee structure. I don't mean individual citizens, but individual members of Congress with us represent the sovereign people to hold the executive branch to account. And it would help if Congress would make themselves, in terms of FOIA reform, subject to the Freedom of Information Act as well.
Well, I think it's an excellent question about how you leverage scarce resources. And one of the things that was very interesting, I have an article that's up today on the Examiner about the Office of Congressional Ethics, which incidentally was created by Nancy Pelosi to go and drain the swamp of corruption. So it turns out nobody has really looked at what they've done, but 2 out of 3, and this is a totally bipartisan entity. It is completely open. Within 90 days, they have to go and come to a decision. They have to tell people about who's under investigation and what they've accepted. It's very transparent, as opposed to the House Ethics Committee, which is completely secretive and closed. And I think that one area that, and this is, I don't think there's any initiative in this here, but one area of opening up the transparency in operations is the whole little cottage industry called the Inspector General's offices. These offices are shrouded in secrecy. You have no idea really what they're doing and what they're working on and what they're looking at. And they are very, very secretive about their conclusions until they are ready to finally issue it. And there's a lot of evidence that these IG offices, which have tremendously large staffs, that these IG offices are really captives of the agency in which they're supposed to oversee. And you can see that in many, many different ways. If there was legislation that required transparency and certain kinds of action within a certain time frame by the IG's offices, that would give some teeth to them. Now, some of the IGs are just not, they don't care about it. I mean, they're in the hip pocket, basically, of the secretary or an agency head. But I think that is one area that we're spending a lot of money on, and we're getting very, very little return.
And those IG reports are often taken as like the gospel truth. Once you see an IG report, there's generally the media reaction is like, well, that's the settled fact.
Exactly.
And
It's
that
not.
that should probably not be the instinct.
Jeff Holder's Inspector General said that he's that he didn't know about gun walking. There are several pieces in past that have not been pursued down that road, and just because the IG said that they, by the way, they didn't say that he didn't know. They say that that they couldn't find any evidence. There's a big difference between those two statements.
Right. I mean, even
yeah.
the crappiest IG report usually has some good stuff in it. The
Yeah.
Fast and Furious report confirmed, in my view, that the Holder Justice Department, from the Attorney General on down, knowingly lied to Congress for nearly a year about Fast and Furious. So when I talk about criminal investigations, there are criminal prosecutions for lying for Congress, and the Attorney General and his people there need to be subject.
And it seems like,
right.
And it seems like, for the most part, to get these congressional committees to actually execute their oversight functions, typically requires that some outside group has already lined up all the facts of the case, so that they don't actually have to undergo an investigation. This is just simply a show for political purposes. So it seems most, oftentimes, certainly Boyle and in his experience at the Daily Caller and now at Breitbart. And what our experience has been, when you reach out to these committees and you ask if they're going to investigate, they ask basically, well, do you have the case closed and open and shut? Well, they're supposed to be investigating, right? So that's unfortunately the reality that we deal with, that outside groups like Judicial Watch, like everyone here, have to sort of undergo all of the steps and show enough leg that these oversight committees go, okay, we've got something here. We're not exactly sure on all the details, but they definitely screwed up, and it's enough for us to score political points off of.
And the mainstream media applauded Henry Waxman when he had all of those show trials, so to speak, these different hearings, these so-called oversight hearings, and he had a very large and aggressive staff. But I'll tell you, when I call in the House or the Senate to staffers about a particular story we're working on or to investigate, I find timidity. I find really timidity by the staffs on both parties. And Waxman was one of the exceptions to the rule. I think that he had a star chamber atmosphere, and he was into witch hunts, but nevertheless, he really put an investment in terms of trying to go after people.
Well, I think one of the reasons ICE is as respected and effective as he is because he does have he's certainly not certainly his operation isn't perfect and is subject to criticism, but he understands the systematic problems on a nonpartisan basis that affect government oversight, where the problems are in government operations, and the Disclose Act is a perfect example of that. And, the operations of government are boring to a lot of Republicans. I mean, that's the long and short of it. They don't care about, they want to make noise about it and complain about it, but the hard work in terms of getting into the nitty-gritty of how it works and where the problems are, there are 3 or 4 congressmen and senators who do that on a regular basis, and everything else is just, and the other folks look at them as providing talking points for them or jokes for Jay Leno, talking about how much a toilet costs in the Pentagon or something like that. Yes, sir.
My name is Bruce Bennett. I'm a local citizen activist, and we deal with these same issues you guys deal with, and I can tell you, if you're getting stiffed by the process, you can imagine how somebody who's down at the very bottom, who has no idea how this works, gets stiffed. I mean, I've been doing this for about 20 years now, and I'm fairly sophisticated. We found how to get in to see the editors of newspapers and so forth. We've been to see some of your people, Richard, and it's been very, very successful. It's a very difficult process. And I have to make one comment. The work that you do it drives the big press that Tom talked about. And I think if you get out there and put your stories out, the big press is driven to cover it as well. And I guess we're looking for ways to get our information that we need to get for our research, for our granular issues, because as Tip O'Neill's father said, all politics is local. That's where we are. We're down in the bowels.
Well, there's a marriage here somewhat, and I hope this point isn't lost on this meeting. It's that if you're conducting investigative journalism yourself and you feel like the platform from which you have to project it is not the size that you need to seek a bigger fish, so to speak. Do that. Look for other outlets that can project it. All of us are willing to have that conversation with you. If you've already undergone the investigation and you have your facts lined up, that's perfect. That's something that we would like to. We're like congressional committees. We'll be happy to talk about it. Bring it to us, and definitely protect us, and you'll get all the credit for having underdone the investigation. But certainly, we believe that if it's big enough, that we want to project it to our audience as well.
I've gotten calls from local investigators, citizen activists, and happy always to, if you're stuck, what are the other ways of getting the information? What are the other avenues on the local level as well as state level sometimes?
Your paper's been outstanding in that regard. The hyper-locals out where we are also good to take us in and listen. And believe me, we're not looking for any credit. This is not what we want. We don't want to bring the wrath of the politicians down on us. That's what you get paid to do.
Well, and there's some value to using the powers of the internet, individual blogging activities, especially at the local level. You don't need a huge audience to have an impact locally. I talk about President Obama pretending he's king. These local officials, they're about as bad as it gets.
Well,
Some of the corrupt runs and criticizing and exposing them directly on the internet, even if it's all you need is one person to read it, and that is the politician that you're concerned about. And that's what gets a strong response. And the impact locally, you can do a little and have a significant impact, especially if you work with the local reporters and get them reading what you're doing as well.
That's perfect. I make one more comment on that.
Go ahead. Make it into the microphone now.
Yeah,
Please.
one of the things that is very important is having a credible reference. And so if we can use the newspaper articles that your paper does and the hyperlocals where we are, and I'll start reading you guys' papers, are very valuable to us as an archival source. And I've got 500 megabytes of information on the issues that I'm working. When I collect that information from the papers, I put the banner on the article and save it with a way of getting to it. So when I testify in front of my local officials or talk to people on the internet, I send them copies of these bannered articles. And I think they're extremely important. So you just believe me, your stuff you're doing is really important.
Yeah, I can't tell you how many leads we've gotten from local folks, and we've done lawsuits on local corruption. I talk about a market that deserves a lot more attention.
I would add too, email me, please. My email is out there. It's mboyle@breitbart.com. Tell me what you guys have. Seriously, we're not like these people that are like here for a panel and we're gone. We're here. We want to investigate this stuff. But oftentimes, like I said, when you see something, say something, we need help. We don't always know where to look to, but you guys do. And tell us where to go. And if you contact us, we will look into it.
Absolutely. In fact, when many of us publish things, we then get unsolicited phone calls from different sources who know additional stuff. We depend upon people we talked about whistleblowers, but even if you're a citizen who's observing something, it's very, very important. So we depend upon people such as people in this room. We are not lone rangers, let me assure you.
Well, and it's important to remember, you may contact folks in the media, and the important purpose initially, frankly, is to put a bug in their ear. We review and try to respond to everyone who contacts us, and sometimes we can't necessarily do something about the issue they're raising. But oftentimes, I can't tell you how many times where it's like, you remember when that person contacted us a few years ago about that subject in that area? And then we go back around again. So all of these issues have an evergreen quality, and I'm telling you that you put something in someone's ear, and it may not be acted upon immediately, but there's the potential for something in the future, even years in the future, to come back around again that kind of says, oh, I remember that issue being raised. I don't remember the email, I don't remember the detail, but boy, it's come up again here. I'm going to look at it more carefully. And you may never get any credit for how that erupted, but that's how things sometimes happens in the investigative field. Yes, in the back, along the window there, please.
Oh. Hi, Pat Spann, just myself. I live in Arlington, so I understand about imperial local politicians. I was wondering if you could, you touched on this earlier, maybe do a little crystal balling on what do you see coming down in the next year or two in the form of executive orders from the administration?
Immigration is going to be huge. They're going to do anything they can to try to essentially give amnesty to all the illegals that are here. So
I would look for I would look for every major public policy to be focused by the administration. The administration is going to be largely unable to get its agenda through Congress, certainly in the next 2 years, on gun rights, on the environment, on health care, on immigration, and anything else. Their industrial policy, they want to do morsel interests. The president has run on doing morsel interests. And those policies are going to have to be implemented. They can't wait for Congress, as the president says. It's the new normal. Anything that you think is important, they're probably going to be doing illicit policy making on.
Mitch McConnell told me ahead of the election, this was at the Republican convention down in Tampa, that should the election go the way it did, that he would be in a position where Republicans would still control the Senate enough that they could stop the forward progress, at least legislatively, of the Obama agenda, which implies, based on what we've seen, and I think what Tom was saying, is that when faced with a barrier, the administration prefers executive order. They'll move in a direction where they don't have to have Congress's assistance.
I was going to say, in addition to that, I would keep a really close eye on, because over the next 2 years you're going to see this happening with the administration, but also keep an eye on what, as conservatives, keep an eye on what the Republicans in Congress are doing. Are they actually doing what they can to stop this? Over the past 2 years, the Speaker has allowed Obamacare to be continued to be funded through continuing resolutions. Every one they vote on funds Obamacare, even though he says he doesn't want to fund Obamacare, he does. But that's another thing, too, that I think that over the next 2 years, there's going to be almost like a rebuilding process on the right. So are Republicans actually doing everything they can to stop the Obama agenda from going through?
Every executive branch administration has always had a bit of an authoritarian streak, a certain kind of hubris. But this administration, I think, has a very deep authoritarian streak. And I think that this is the kind of way that Obama is interested in actually sort of showing he has leadership, that he is going, that silly legislature there, we're going to go and act with executive orders.
And it's euphemisms like prosecutorial discretion that, like, it's always very interesting to hear something like that, which basically means, look, we're not enforcing the law. That's our option.
What's the definition of is it?
So, I mean, it happens, and again, I referenced marijuana earlier because I think, those especially our libertarian friends who have been, clamoring for legalization, look at something like that and they see the president come out and say that we're not going to prosecute illegal immigrants of a certain age in this country. Yet, when you have states that are now passing like legalization laws for marijuana, the federal government's actually still going in and enforcing the law in those cases. So Obama's basically saying, look, we've got the power to decide which laws we feel like enforcing, and some we are, some we aren't. And another example that was referenced earlier was that they don't want to defend DOMA in court, which leaves House Republicans now to defend it as it goes before the Supreme Court, because the Justice Department has decided we have no interest in defending federal law in this case.
There is nothing more useless generally as an interagency task force. However, the president's decision to have an interagency task force headed by Vice President Biden on gun control, I think, is going to come up with some they're going to try to federalize, I think, the gun control.
I do find it interesting that in that press conference, Biden was standing next to him, but was excused when reporters began to ask questions. He was like, you can go now.
Well, and the other big issue is election integrity. The left has decided that they don't like states running elections themselves, so now there's talk of universal registration and essentially pushing to have wholesale federal control of our election process. And by federal control, that means the left is going to be running the elections, and those that support the left will benefit, and those that don't won't. And besides undermining our constitutional provisions that provide the state's abilities to run the time, place, and manner, and location of elections. So that's going to be a significant area. The Attorney General's already expressed support for it. They've moved beyond voter ID, and they just want everyone to be registered to vote by the federal government, and they want to cut out the state's efforts to protect the integrity of the vote that comes with voter registration processes run by the state. So it's a significant threat to local control of elections by the left wing that's running the Obama administration right now. We have time for maybe one more question. Yes, sir, in the center, you've been patient. You know what, and if you could just ask your question, and then you had a question as well, and then ask your question, and then we'll get our panel to answer both questions.
That'll be
at
fine.
once to finish.
My name's Robert Hoffman. I'm a retired federal employee. I actually I worked in the Office of International Affairs and Treasury when Tim Geithner came through as a new graduate from college. So I feel partly responsible for it. But nevertheless, I'm really troubled. I'm really happy to see that all you folks do the work you do, and I fully support what your programs and so forth. But it just seems to me that where is the outrage really going to come from the electorate? What you're publishing, you would think by now the country would be up in arms, would be marching up and down Pennsylvania Avenue, but nothing's happening. And I don't know what it's going to take to actually get, or what will it take to actually get the whole electorate enraged enough to actually force changes through Congress, through wherever.
And your other question, please, ma'am?
Thank you. Jamie Morris from Cause of Action. And my question kind of actually piggybacks off of yours, off of the fact of thank you again for all being here. However, there's not enough of you and there's not enough of us.
That's right.
Going back to Fast and Furious, you talked about the multiple FOIA requests that you had and the long process it's taken for you to get the information that you had. And when you did get that information, it wasn't fully there. At that point, though, what do? You're a reporter. You're the one that's out there. You're the one that's pointing this out. You're the one that's waving your hands in the air, and yet still nothing is being done. When there's organizations like ourselves, we point this out. We have done the investigation. We have reason to believe that someone should be fired, and nothing has happened. The organizations are speaking, reporters are speaking, but clearly something is missing. And I know you referenced, Matthew, that there's a bridge that you're trying to gap between making it easier for whistleblowers to come forward both to you and to organizations. But at that point, what is the remedy, or what are you hoping to achieve in the future to solve this?
I think to answer, I think both questions at the same time would be that we need political will in Washington to accomplish anything. And what you have to do is you have to find people who are able to rile up a crowd and get people here. The perfect example of where there was an actual push for accountability was the Tea Party movement. And the thing is that one has to wonder, where are those leaders? They're still up there on Capitol Hill. Why aren't they out there bringing the crowds right back up here? And I would imagine that over the next couple of years, you might start seeing some of that stuff happen again, and it's going to be a lot stronger. But at the same time, what we need to do is, and there's already an effort underway afoot to do this, I think, over the next few months to kind of build partnerships between different media organizations and investigative bodies such as Cause of Action, which I think you guys do amazing work over there, and groups like Judicial Watch, and I think that when they're part of the problem is when I get to the end of that FOIA and they say they even say in the letter that we provided only what we thought was responsive, and there are more documents there. The point is that how do you fight that? Like, that's one of the things that I'm not a lawyer, so one of the things I have to do is I have to decide, is it worth going for those extra documents, or do I have enough here to prove my point? And one of the things is that if I had a partnership with organizations like Judicial Watch and Cause of Action, we'd be able to accomplish things like that, I think, in a much more streamlined manner.
I know we're all happy to sue,
Right.
and I mean, Cause of Action is a perfect example of a group that, a smallish group, right? You're operating, 2 years now?
14 months.
14 months. But they've had impactful stories with just a little leverage. And the electorate is primed for this issue. We have 250,000 supporters. There's a reason Barack Obama talks about transparency all the time, because he knows Americans want it. There's a reason Democrats talked about the culture of corruption and taking back Congress from Republicans, because they understand that corruption is something that infuriates both sides of the aisle. our poll this year with Breitbart on election night, we had corruption in federal government is a serious concern among voters, with 85% saying they're concerned and 53% saying they are very concerned.
But oftentimes
They didn't believe either party was capable of cleaning it up. But imagine the opportunity for leadership about a smart politician who's honest and ethical who said, this is going to be my issue. So where's the leadership?
Romney chose not to make corruption an issue in his campaign. He chose not to run on it. He ignored Fast and Furious. He ignored the Delphi pension scandal. He could have scandalized the bailout. He could have turned the bailout into Solyndra. Easy. And he chose not to do it. Now, that's the thing is that are people actually going to stand up on these issues? Because you can make it a part of a larger platform about trying to fix the economy. And I think that in the long run here, I think you might start to see either people are going to get it or it's...
We're going to get accountability in spite of the politicians.
Right.
The electorates will agree with us, and the question is, how do we we think of ways to get around the politicians and getting accountability? Because the electorate is with us on this, and Democrats and Republicans, they love us during, the Democrats like us more during the Bush administration than they do during the Obama administration. But they all agree that there needs to be oversight and accountability. And, if you ask the left about transparency in the Obama administration, they're even more complaining about it than we are.
But to Robert, to your point very quickly, what Matt mentioned was right, though, is that obviously we have to figure out ways. It seems to work in spite of politicians. But when our leadership in this country from either party makes it an issue, then it becomes a national issue. I mean, as soon as the president mentions a name, that name becomes a national flashpoint. It doesn't even matter what context he's talking about them. Ask Kanye West. But when you've got Speaker Boehner or the president that begin to have these conversations, then that'll happen. It looks like oftentimes, and as you hear from Boyle, people like Boehner aren't having that conversation. Jamie, meanwhile, the FOIA question that you have, I would refer. I've sat in on several Judicial Watch events, and I believe you have resources on your website that are towards FOIA. How to fill out a FOIA. Oftentimes, I'm sure you've experienced this, but oftentimes the biggest problem with FOIAs is that citizens don't know how to fill them out appropriately. This is like a very simple issue. Judicial Watch goes back and forth, and they keep on getting more and more information from behind the black bars that are like blocking out all the information that you really want. But in order to get that first FOIA, when it finally gets to you, make sure that the form that you send in has appropriate language. You need to figure out a way to back that FOIA official into a corner where they have no choice but to give you the information that they want. You can't ask general questions. You have to be very specific about the information you're looking for, the ways that information was disseminated, what mediums were used to send it around. And it's going to take some footwork on your part, but once you establish a template for how you send a good FOIA in, you can constantly rely on that to continually do that.
And that's especially true at the local level, because it's a tremendous, the FOIA laws are even sometimes better at the state and local level. The federal level, unfortunately, on issues of political consequence or public policy consequence, a lawsuit. You can write the best FOIA in the world, and they know what they're doing when they say no or they refuse to comply. And we've been most effective, and I know cause of action, you know about this as best as we do. Suing is usually the only way to get a response. And this is from the most transparent administration in history. But that's the advice I give. If you really want something, investigative reporters need to have a litigation budget that is multiples of what is currently there, and it's not being done enough.
You talk about the difference between the federal and the local level on FOIAs. In Chicago, which we all know is a very open city, right? There's no corruption there. But in Chicago, the FOIA Act requires that they get a response within 5 business days, which is really pretty interesting.
Right.
And many states also have that requirement. I will say I'm a bit more hopeful because there are different groups like Cause for Action. Washington Free Beacon is now working. There are other kinds of independent media outlets that are being formed that I think are beginning to try to bring some honesty in coverage. So, I mean, I'm hopeful that there's more of an investment, that the Daily Caller is great, Breitbart. I mean, it's really, there are new institutions that are being built, and that's a cause for hope for me.
Well, and I want to close out attacking Tim Geithner, because you reminded me about Tim Geithner. He's one of the worst Treasury secretaries. It's become one of the most important agencies in the government. It used to be a FOIA backwater. They're doing as much as anything in terms of government spending, and it's completely uncontrolled. They have no interest in transparency. I mean, just today I'm reading in the Washington Examiner about USB Bank, being fined $1.5 billion, it is, for supposedly manipulating LIBOR, which is essentially an international interest rate. Well, guess who knew about that manipulation and was happy to allow it to proceed and did nothing about it, and frankly validated it by not doing anything about it? Timothy Geithner. Why isn't he being prosecuted and fined? He was in on a conspiracy. These are the sorts of in-your-face, mega scandal issues that I don't know anything about anything when it comes to international finance, but I can put two and two together and reading two different stories and see Tim Geithner was involved in LIBOR, and they're doing all these investigations. Why isn't he being investigated about it? This is a typical example of a mega story where there's so much money being spent and so much scandal there that's just ignored by virtually every oversight institution in the city. Well, with that happy thought, we're there to do it. And these folks are here to do it. So I'd like to thank you for your participation in this holiday week, and Merry Christmas to everyone. I know it's tough in these days coming up to Christmas to make time available. But the government's corrupt no matter whether there's a holiday or not. So unfortunately, we're always working. So thank you for your participation. Everyone's available here on the internet. We have Judicial Watch's own website, judicialwatch.org. It's at WashingtonExaminer.com, thedailycaller.com, and Breitbart.com. And you can Google every topic we're talking about, and you can see everything we're saying is true. So thank you for your support, and we'll see you next year. Appreciate it.